Hey there, today I'm going to show you how to take your image from this to my take on a blurry film negative look here in Adobe Photoshop. There is some artistic liberty taken since I don't think you'd typically find this dark foresty green color alongside this white and blue inverted look in a real 35mm film negative, but I find it fits in nicely to the gradient map that we'll use later in this tutorial, and it does help break out our subject more from the background. As far as the grain goes, I wasn't trying to emulate any specific film stock. This is just to my liking, to my taste, and I'll show you a couple of different ways of getting that noise into your image. First thing we're going to do is Control-N to create a new document. I want to size it 2160 for the width and 2700 for the height. That's measured in pixels. Resolution is set to 300 ppi, color mode RGB color with an 8-bit bit depth. And background contents can be set to white. That's fine. We'll go ahead and create. Now I'm going to drag in my image from unsplash.com, bring it in here, press the check mark to set it. And although I could scale this image up to recompose and fill up the canvas, I'm actually going to use this opportunity to show you how I use content-aware fill more often than not. First thing I'm doing on this smart object is right-clicking and selecting Rasterize Layer. Now press M for the rectangular marquee tool. Click and drag until we're just a bit over onto the image. Now shift backspace for the fill dialog, and we want to set the contents to content aware. If you're not already seeing that option, click the drop down here and select content aware before going to hit OK. We wait for Photoshop, and now it's done a pretty good job of filling up that negative space with what it sees in the original image. Some artifacting and weird smudging here, but by the time we're done with all of our blurring, you're not really going to detect all of that. Now let's go over to this side. Same thing with the rectangular marquee. Click and drag over until we're just before that hair there. We don't want to hit all of this hair because Photoshop will try to fill up the negative space with a ton of hair, which we don't want. Shift backspace, set the contents to content aware, press OK. Control D to deselect, and Photoshop's done a pretty good job here, actually better than the other side in my opinion. So that's how we can expand the bounds of the image to fill up the canvas without changing the composition of the image that we dragged in. The next thing I want to do is duplicate this layer, so Control J. I'll rename it to Radial Blur, because that's the filter we'll wind up using. Right click, convert it to a smart object. I'll hide the layer underneath. And now I'll go up to filter, scroll down, go to blur, and select radial blur right there. The biggest thing when dialing in your radial blur is you'll have to click and drag the blur center where you want it to appear on the canvas. Of course, this is a square thumbnail, and this is a rectangular image, so it's a little bit of a guessing game to make sure you wind up with the right spot, but that's why we have it as a smart object, so we can double-click on the smart filter, go back in, and make adjustments as needed. Setting the amount at 30 here, I want it pretty heavy, but not too overblown. Blur method is kept on spin, and I'm keeping the quality at good because sometimes cranking it up to best can use up too many resources on your device. Gonna press OK and see what happens. That's looking pretty good, although I would actually prefer having the center a little bit further down here in between the eyebrows, right around the bridge of the nose, I think. So I'll double click on the radial blur, drag it just a little bit, micro adjustment, press OK. Sometimes you have to do this a few times. That's looking pretty bang on to me. That feels pretty close to how I had it in the original. So gonna leave that there, looking good. The thing I need to do now though is I want to create a mask on the filter so we reveal detail back on the face, get more definition overall going into the forearm. So what I'll do is I'll click on the smart filter mask. I'm gonna press B for my brush tool. Gonna make sure it's the soft round brush, and you can leave opacity, flow, smoothing all the same. Just need to make sure that the color of the brush is black because we're working with a white filter. And I'm going to use the brackets on my keyboard to adjust the size, maybe to about there. I'll press once, And that's looking pretty good to me. I think that's pretty close to how I had it in the original. We might wind up with something that is a little bit of a smaller brush radius than the first pass I did of this effect, but overall, I think that's pretty good. Maybe I'll give it one more go. I'll go one step up, click again, and yeah, that feels a lot better actually. So we'll go with that smart filter mask. Control 0 to fill the frame. The next thing I need to do is add our glow to the entirety of the image. The look I'm going for here is kind of an overwhelming pro mist filter for all of my photography friends out there. A pretty heavy-handed pro mist filter look I think will be nice here, and it's also the easiest approach to take when it comes to adding glow to your image, a lot of diffusion. So what I'll do is Control J, duplicate this layer. I'm going to rename this to glow. Now I'll turn this into a new smart object, right click, go up, convert to smart object. I'm going to go up to filter, going to go down to blur, Gaussian blur, and I'm going to set the value to about 30. I think that'll work nicely for a diffuse spread across the entirety of our canvas here. Now I'm going to go up to my blend modes, click on the drop down, going to screen, and we're already starting to see quite a bit of glow. In this instance, I do want to dial it back though. Easiest way to dial that glow back is I'm going up to opacity. I'll highlight that. I'm going to go straight for 50%. And I think that feels pretty good. For you, you might want to introduce some contrast back. Rather than touching the opacity, at this point you could add a levels adjustment. Control L to add that levels adjustment. Take the middle slider, maybe bring it over somewhere around 60 might feel good. You can start to see some more darkness in the hair there, the eyes, etc. In my case though, I actually quite like the glow just being super overwhelming. I don't mind that at all because I know how it's going to interact with the gradient map we're bringing into play, so no worries there. You can also play around with your glow by duplicating this layer 2-3 times, and then with each subsequent layer playing around with the Gaussian blur, playing around with its opacity, and seeing how that works for your image. I'm going to go ahead and group these two layers, Control G with them both selected, rename it to blur and glow just to keep things a little bit more compartmentalized. We're now good to go into the gradient map portion of the tutorial. If you're wondering how I came to the color palette that I did, I was exploring on Adobe Color, found a really great image of a film negative strip, extracted the palette from there, selected each individual color. There's 5 stops with the color picker, and brought that into the gradient map and created a preset. In this tutorial, only going to show you how to create the gradient map and show you all the values that I used. But in the future, I probably will do a more in-depth tutorial of how to integrate Adobe Color into your project and use it in a similar fashion to how I did. First thing we're going to do is go down to create adjustment layer, click on that, click on gradient map, and first things first, I'm going to change this to dither and smooth. That will help just reduce a little bit more of the banding that gradient maps can create between color stops. Also, I need to make sure that rather than the mask being selected, I have the actual gradient icon selected on the layer. For some reason, whenever Photoshop creates a gradient map, I've noticed by default, at least on my system, it always has the mask selected. But if we move forward and start making changes to the gradient map with that icon selected, it's only going to affect the mask, not anything else in our document. Now I'm going up to click on the strip, and I'm going down to my presets and selecting this one here. That's the appropriate one. You'll notice though that this is not inverted in the least. I was not paying attention when I initially created this gradient map and didn't think about the inversion process to put this stop here and this stop there. You get the idea. Anyway, it's a pretty simple fix because I can just press OK and then click on the reverse option here, so that way I don't have to tediously move all of my stops. So that works out. I'm going to, on screen for a second, leave all of the values and stop positions for you, those locations. Give you a moment there to copy everything down before moving forward. And now I'm going to get out of here. And this is looking great. I really like the gradient map. However, the overall image is just way too dim. So to counteract that, I'm first going to bring my gradient map outside of that group, and I'm going to go down to create adjustment layer and select curves. Now, I already created a preset for this particular project. My presets are stored here in this dropdown. Go down to blurry film. You can see what I did here was I created one point in the middle of the curves line and dragged up the midtones like that. You probably won't have that, so I'll just reset quick and redo it. I'll click in the middle here, bring this value up to about here's looking pretty good. If you personally want to save any curves presets, all you have to do is after making adjustments, you can click on the hamburger icon here and then save curves preset and it will be added to your library. Gonna exit out of this. Now I've brightened up the image, I have my gradient map, but I want to add grain. And there's a couple of different approaches, but both of them involve a gray fill layer, a 50% gray fill layer to be exact. I go down here to create new layer, shift backspace to get my fill dialog, click the drop down to get my 50% gray option, press OK. I'm going to right click, convert to a smart object, rename this layer to camera raw because the first approach we're taking is using the camera raw filter in Photoshop. I can either go up to filter and go down to click camera raw filter, or I can use the shortcut Control-Shift-A for PC users. Click on that. And all we have to worry about in here is the effects dropdown, specifically the grain portion in the camera raw filter. The top slider affects the overall amount of grain that's going into the image. You can see at 100, chock full of grain. As I slide back to the left, a lot less. In this case, I want a value of 60. I already know that works for me. As far as size and roughness goes, I'll zoom in a bit here. The smaller the size, the sharper the grain is going to be, really tiny sharp dots going on there. So I do need a little bit more size here. I'm thinking of going right up to 70 will be pretty good for my needs. I want pretty heavy grain, but don't need to go past that point. Same sort of situation with roughness, because as you go to the left, you'll see there's this high pass filter sort of look, overly sharp, a lot of ghosting on the edges. So I want my roughness to be significantly higher. I'm actually going to drop it down to, I think 55 will work. You'll see now it looks a lot more natural, a lot more cloudy, dispersing the noise accordingly. That's looking good to me. We can toggle the eyeball on and off to see what we did. Press OK. Now I need to click on the blend modes and select overlay, and that will affect all areas of the image, both light and dark. And that's looking pretty great. Maybe I want to reel it back a bit. Rather than using opacity, I'm going to use fill. I'm going to set that to 75%. That's looking pretty good to me. Now I'm going to show you how to achieve grain with a different filter in Photoshop, the noise filter. Control J, duplicate this layer. I'm going to hide the one underneath, rename this to noise filter, delete the camera raw filter by right clicking on the smart filter, delete smart filter, going to reset the fill percentage to 100% and change the blend mode back to normal. Now I'm going up to filter, going down to noise, add noise, and we're given a few options here. We have the amount percentage slider. I'm personally going to leave that at 20%. Of course, if you want even more grain, you could drag this over to the right. Then there's the distribution, which is either uniform or Gaussian. Uniform, the noise is a lot more packed together, a lot closer. With Gaussian distribution, the noise is spread out further and there's this stippled sort of look. I'm fine with leaving it at uniform distribution. And then there's also a box you can check to have monochromatic noise or leave it unchecked for color noise. I'm going to leave it set at monochromatic so that it more closely matches the camera raw filter version for our comparisons. I'll press OK. Now I'm going over to the blend modes. I'm going to overlay, so it affects all areas of the image. And what you'll notice is that in comparison to the camera raw filter, this noise is very boxy, very pixelated, sharp edges. We don't want that. So we do need to introduce some blur. I'll click on the layer. I'll go up to filter, go down to blur, Gaussian blur, gonna have a super low value. Keep it around 1. That'll spread it out just enough. And I'm gonna set the fill percentage at 75% to mirror the camera raw layer. We'll compare and contrast here, go a little more towards the face. So here's our grain with our noise filter setup, and then here's our grain with our camera raw filter setup. One more time, the noise filter, and then here's the camera raw filter. Personally, I'm feeling the camera raw version a lot more, so I'm going to delete the noise filter, but just know that there's a couple of different ways to go about it, and you're welcome to experiment to get the results that you personally enjoy. We've got our grain introduced, and there's only one thing left to do, which is add a texture from texturelabs.org on top to add a little more interest to all of these dark green areas that aren't seeing so much love right now. Grabbing my texture, dragging it in, wait a second, rotate 90 degrees, scale it up to fit the canvas, press that check mark, and I'm gonna set the blend mode to screen, and that's already looking great. I am noticing that perhaps there's a little bit too much sharpness in some of these scratches of that texture. To combat that, I can go up to Filter, go to Blur, Gaussian Blur, keep it a super low value. I usually do between 0.2 to 0.4, maybe even 0.3 in this particular case, and that'll make it blend into the image underneath a lot better. If I want to cool it down even further, maybe get a little bit less of that texture, I can also add a levels adjustment, Control L, drag that middle slider over just a little bit, maybe somewhere around 0.88, I think would be good. And that's looking great to me. So Control 0 to fill the frame, click on this layer, Shift click down to the radial blur, Control G to group everything together. I'll rename this group Final Process, rename the layer underneath to Original. Time for final comparison. So here was our original image, albeit the one with the content-aware fill on the sides, but you get the idea. And then here's our final process, which looks fantastic. Really easy effect to achieve in Photoshop. Love the radial blur, love the gradient map, and all the grain and dust and scratches that we've introduced. You're welcome to play around with the blur method. Motion blur, something a little more angular, could also look really cool, and then masking out certain portions. Different gradient map, you could go for more of a heat map look. And then of course you could do different types of grain, different intensity of grain, whatever seems appropriate to you. The main reason I like the radial blur here is because it adds a lot more motion to the frame, as well as adding a lot more focus to our subject's face, a lot more emotion in that expression and the eyes. So that's really cool. Thanks for watching. I hope this helps you along your Photoshop journey, and expect more tutorials coming soon.